I do have an amendment calling for a study.
Yeah, you know about his amendment?
The revised, yes, sir.
Yeah, I think they've accepted it.
Clerks are ready.
Okay.
I think
Should I give my spiel?
it's up to you. Haven't they accepted his amendment?
My understanding is there will be voice voted, yes.
Yeah, they've accepted it. This hearing of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services will be called to order. Before getting into the details of the mark, I want to start off by thanking my colleague and friend from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper. We've traveled together to see French and British nuclear warheads and our overseas missile defenses, and I've gotten to know his sweet wife, and we've spent countless hours and innumerable briefings learning about some really scary stuff. Proof that our oversight is desperately needed, and we have worked together in a transparent and completely bipartisan way for 4 years now. I appreciate his thoughtful input and seriousness with which he approaches this subject. I just wish he had better judgment when it comes to college football. So let me turn to the details of the mark, which I'm very proud of. Let's start with the national security space. The subcommittee mark tackles the serious foreign counter space threat to our space systems by providing the necessary resources to build up our space security and defense capabilities. It also ensures the department is organized properly and has the authorities it needs to maintain our national security space advantage long into the future. The mark also ensures that key national security requirements will be met for space weather capabilities by starting the transfer of acquisition authority and budget authority for that mission from the Air Force over to the NRO. Concerning the nuclear enterprise, the mark consolidates and strengthens the Air Force's organizational structures to ensure the nation's nuclear command and control and mission warning systems remain robust. I know the Air Force would prefer to be left alone to organize itself as it sees fit, but I continue to worry that when 4 different 4-star generals are in charge of something, no one's in charge of it. Nuclear command and control is too important to be left to suffer from poor organization. The mark prohibits the Department of Energy from sending U.S. taxpayer money to Russia until the Secretary of Energy certifies that there is no backlog of deferred physical security infrastructure projects in the U.S. nuclear enterprise. Putin doesn't need our money. He's got more than enough to invade Ukraine and Syria and violate the INF Treaty. It provides enhanced authority for the Department of Energy to mitigate threats from unmanned aircraft at its most sensitive nuclear facilities. Concerning NNSA's core mission, we have recommended to the chairman an increase of over $300 million to NNSA's critical nuclear weapons activities, including $150 million to get on top of the massive deferred maintenance problem across our nuclear enterprise. Jim and I have seen these problems firsthand in our trips, and we need to fix these problems before they hurt the dedicated workers in the enterprise or shut down the mission. As NNSA has said to this committee, quote, infrastructure risks become safety and program risks, close quote. And it sets clear priorities by fully funding the National Nuclear Security Administration's core nuclear weapons production programs while prohibiting funding for Secretary Kerry's announced 20% acceleration to the rate at which the U.S. dismantles retired nuclear weapons, which is another way of saying unilateral disarmament. Concerning missile defense, the mark fences off half of the funding for the Army's lower-tier air and missile defense radar modernization program. Let me be clear about this. I will take a backseat to no one in supporting modernization of the Patriot, but I will demand the Army do a better job for its soldiers, including its air defenders, than delaying the procurement of a modern radar system until 2028. The United States can do better than a 58-year-old radar system. The mark also would fence $10 million in funding that the DoD provides to the White House until the Congress receives both a plan and sees the beginning of implementation of the development of a military response to a Russian violation of the INF Treaty consistent with Section 1243 of the FY17 NDAA. And most significantly to me, we have recommended to the chairman a significant increase of over $400 million for the Missile Defense Agency and full funding of the request of our allies in Israel, $600.7 million for co-development and co-production of Iron Dome, David Sling, and Era 3. These are vital increases to keep our missile defenses and those of our allies paced well ahead of our adversaries' increasingly complex ballistic missile capabilities. Now is not the time to cut these programs and activities as the President's budget proposed. The chair now recognizes my friend and colleague, the ranking member from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper, for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to work with you as a friend and colleague on what are probably the world's and certainly America's weightiest issues. Nuclear issues and space issues are often ignored, oftentimes don't get the attention and focus that they deserve, sometimes even from our own services. But I'm glad that we see eye to eye on so many of these issues. And it's tempting in a markup to highlight differences instead of similarities, but I think it's important that the nation and the world to know that we are in agreement on having a safe, secure, and reliable nuclear arsenal. And I'm sure the chairman's remarks about a dismantlement being possibly unilateral disarmament were more for rhetoric than substance, because I believe the plan that people have agreed to on a bipartisan basis is to have greater uniformity in our nuclear weapons and to make sure that they all work properly. That inevitably means discontinuing some product lines. So I hope that we can proceed in a bipartisan and sensible basis to pursue what really are bipartisan national security objectives. There are a number of amendments today that I have been notified about, and I look forward to discussing them in more detail, but I'm relieved that really most of them are just requests for additional studies. So the central nature of your mark, is, I believe, will stand intact. We may, on the majority side, request striking amendments or modification amendments at the full committee level, but it's our plan today just to hear out the presenters of the amendments, understand their motives and their language, and to be able to make more sensible decisions at the full committee level. The markup is scheduled at a time when the House has completed its final votes for the day and for the week. Many members are facing very pressing schedules, so I believe that we'll have more complete attendance at the time of the full committee markup. So it's, again, Mr. Chairman, a pleasure to work with you. It's an even greater pleasure to know your wife, the judge. Beth is a remarkable lady and a terrific asset to you and to your representation of the good people of Alabama. This year could be our year, so don't discount Tennessee's prospects. I know you're riding high right now as national champions, but that doesn't last forever. And each season is a new season, so we look forward to that.
Yeah. The third Saturday in October is never a good day when we know we have to play Tennessee. But thanks for that. We'll now proceed to the markup of H.R. 4909, the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 2017. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Copies of our subcommittee mark and directive report language were made available and distributed to members' offices on Tuesday. Is there any discussion or questions on the subcommittee mark? If there is no discussion, the chair lays before the members the text of the subcommittee mark for consideration. Without objection, the mark is open to amendment at any point. Are there any amendments to the subcommittee mark? Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Chairman Turner.
Mr. Chairman, I want to congratulate you and the ranking member on an excellent mark and also the bipartisan spirit in which you bring this bill forward. I do have an amendment at the desk, log 3, regarding an intelligence assessment of government command and control and continuity of the People's Republic of China and Russian Federation. I understand, continuing in the bipartisan spirit of this mark, that this amendment has been worked and approved by both the majority and the minority, and I ask for its adoption. It requires the Director of National Intelligence to submit an assessment to Congress on leadership, survivability, command and control, and continuity of government programs in Russia and China, and further requires an assessment by the DoD Council on oversight of the National Leadership, Command, Control, and Communications System, and an assessment by U.S. Strategic Command. This assessment would be incorporated into, would require incorporation of the knowledge of other countries' programs aimed at ensuring regime survivability into our nuclear planning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
I noticed on page 4 of the gentleman's amendment, he says that each report or assessment submitted under the section shall be submitted in unclassified form. but may include a classified annex. That is traditional language, but I would submit to the gentleman, if we're going to have a meaningful assessment of command and control of the People's Republic of China or the Russian Federation's activities, I would suggest to the gentleman that it would make a lot more sense if it were classified only, because the last thing we would want to do is tip our hands in any way, possibly unintentionally, to the leaders of those countries. So I think the gentleman is on the right track. I would just suggest very gently and in a bipartisan way that there'd be much more use to the study if it were solely on a classified basis.
Will the gentleman yield?
Just a moment, Mr. Chairman. Would the clerk pass out a copy of the gentleman's amendment, or do we already have one?
That's been done.
Okay, never mind. Go ahead, Ms. Turner.
Excellent point. I think a good compromise would be on page 4, where that provision is just to insert the word may instead of shall. That way we allow those who have the technical expertise to determine what it is that they're submitting to us, and ensure that they have an ability to both communicate publicly and in a classified manner. If there's no objection, perhaps I could ask the chairman for unanimous consent to the amendment to be amended so that paragraph D on page 4, the substitution would be the word may for shall.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
A much improved amendment. I congratulate the gentleman.
Is there further discussion on the gentleman from Ohio's Mr. Turner's amendment?
It's amazing, Mr. Chairman, what a difference a word makes.
Especially when it's your word.
Well, no, it was the gentleman's amendment. I just made a gentle suggestion that it might be more appropriate. So.
If not, the question is on the amendment as amended by Mr. Turner. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment as amended is adopted. Are there further amendments? Gentleman, Mr. Forbes, Chairman Forbes.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
Would the clerk pass out the amendment? Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Chair now recognizes Chairman Forbes to explain his amendment.
Chairman, I'd also like to thank you and the ranking member for the good work you've done on this, Mark. But this study simply directs the Commanding General, U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command to conduct a study and report to Congress on the potential utility of fielding U.S. intermediate-range ground-launching missiles in order to inform policy and signal to the Russians that violation of the INF Treaty will have consequences. What we know now, Mr. Chairman, is this. We know that we're complying with this treaty, but China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia now is not complying with the treaty. This study does two things. First of all, it makes sure if this treaty continues to break down and we ultimately have to move away from it, we're ready. We know what the military consequences of that and how important these missiles could be. But the second thing, this is one of those situations where the study itself sends a message to the Russians that we're not going to continue to tolerate them breaking this treaty, and if they do, that we're moving to show them that there are going to be consequences for it. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Is there any further discussion? Gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, is recognized.
Thank you, and I too will congratulate the team, your staff, as well as both the minority and majority on the work that they've done thus far. I think what I'm looking at here is a reestablishment of the 1970, 80, 90 program of surface-to-surface missiles, medium-range nuclear missiles, presumably to be placed in Europe. Is that what this is all about?
Chairman, I'd be glad to respond to that.
Yes, please.
No, I think the gentleman's misreading it. I think what you're seeing is that this is a study of the military impact of such missiles, because what we know right now is that the Chinese are doing it, we know the North Koreans are doing it, we know the Iranians are doing it, but most importantly, while we have this treaty that we're complying with, we know now the Russians are breaking this treaty based upon the State Department's conclusion to that effect. What this study does is not to put anything back into effect, but it shows us the military utilization and importance of those missiles so that we are at least in a position that if the Russians continue to break this treaty, we have done two things. One, signal to them there's going to be consequences from them breaking the treaty, and the second thing, to know how important these missiles may be to us if we continue to comply with a treaty that the other party to the treaty is not complying with.
Is your intention that this question go to the establishment of a nuclear armed missile? Is that where you're headed with this?
What my intention, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
What my intention with this study is to do what I said initially. One, to let us know the military consequences of these missiles and how important they may or may not be, whether it is both from a military point of view or cost imposition strategy on others. But the second thing I would say to the gentleman is the importance of sending a message to the Russians that there will be consequences, and one of the consequences is us doing the study so we're in a prepared state if they continue to break the treaty.
I thank the gentleman for the information, and this raises an alarm bell for me that we are moving down an additional path towards a nuclear arms race. We know that we are moving down that path with regard to the new long-range cruise missile and the associated weapon, the new B-21 bomber, and new land-based ICBMs, all of them with rebuilt new and modified nuclear weapons, and now we would add this to the yet one other additional path, raising a major concern of mine. I understand what you're trying to accomplish here, but once again, we are initiating a revival of a nuclear arms race. Maybe we're already there.
Is there any further discussion on the gentleman's amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking member is recognized.
I would suggest to my colleague and friend from Virginia that we are all concerned about the recent actions of the Russian Federation in regard to violations of the INF Treaty. We're concerned about the activities of other nations as well, but as alarming as these actions are, because these are intermediate range missiles, the greater threat is probably to our allies in Europe and elsewhere. And I would be interested in the gentleman's reaction if perhaps NATO should take this as seriously as we do, because while we provide a nuclear umbrella, it seems as if some of our allies are not as attentive to these issues as they perhaps need to be. So I would hope that we could have a feature of this study that would encourage our allies, both in Europe and elsewhere around the world, that would be directly threatened by the development of this new type of missile, to take it as serious as we in fact are. So I commend the gentleman on his amendment. I just think that we need to make sure that our allies are on board in facing this threat.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be delighted.
I'm happy to work with the gentleman as we go into the full markup and further to get language that may be more comfortable in doing that. We have tried to have a number of different exchanges of wording, but we certainly want to continue to do that to make sure that we're getting the right study and the right language in there.
Well, I thank my friend.
Yeah, and I share the ranking member's concern. I would like to see NATO have a little bit more enthusiasm for some of these issues than they do. Any further discussion? If not, the question's on adoption of the amendment by Chairman Forbes. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. All right, are there any further amendments? Gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Will the clerk please pass out the amendment? Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this simple amendment requires an independent review of whether Missile Defense Agency budget submissions fully fund requirements for ground-based mid-course defense. As you know, the United States, its deployed forces, and its allies are facing a rapidly growing threat from intermediate and long-range ballistic missiles technology posed by rogue states and near-peer conventional militaries. As General Charles Jacoby, the previous commander of NORTHCOM, recently said, the homeland has never been more vulnerable than it is today. Recent activity by North Korea and the Islamic Republic of Iran show us just how real the threat to the United States is. In addition, there were over 300 foreign ballistic missile launches and almost 70 foreign space launches in calendar year 2015, according to National Air and Space Intelligence Center. To ensure that our nation stays ahead of the threat, we must strengthen our homeland and regional ballistic missile defense posture and invest in technologies to better enable addressing emerging threats in the next decade. Faced with unpredictable and dangerous regimes, a reliable and effective ballistic missile defense system is absolutely vital. Protecting the U.S. homeland against nuclear attack must be our highest priority. My amendment will help ensure that our current and future system is fully funded to meet the threats of today and tomorrow. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
I commend the gentleman from Colorado because we want to make sure that not only this defense requirement, but all defense requirements are fully funded. I think if the gentleman would look more closely, that he will discover that using various congressional devices such as OCO funding and things like that, but also our increased borrowing from China in the last decade and a half, that the distressing conclusion arises that we really haven't fully funded our military in a decade or two. Not just the missile defense aspect, but many aspects. That is indeed regrettable because when we're borrowing money from China and other nations like that, they are even more likely to be aware of our unwillingness, for example, to issue war bonds, as we have in almost every other conflict, to pay for our needs of our servicemen and women. There's a book called The Price of Liberty that discusses the way we funded all of America's conflicts and our defense budgets, and the conclusion of that book is that we are indeed failing to meet the standards of previous generations when it comes to full funding. So I'm completely with the gentleman on the full funding issue. I'm worried, however, about the language of his study request when he requests evaluation of a transportable ground-based interceptor. That was explored in the Carter administration, I believe, with the MX missile. This is a pretty radical change, and I don't know if the gentleman has discussed this with our missile caucus, the states of Wyoming, Montana, and North Dakota. But to have a road mobile sort of missile, like some of our potential adversaries are trying to field, would indeed be a radical change in America's defense posture. Perhaps we want to engage in this, but I would submit to the gentleman that, kind of like my request to Mr. Turner, that a study of this type not necessarily be unclassified. To me, that would be needlessly aiding our potential adversaries as we disclose to them publicly what we were thinking in this regard. So I share the gentleman's concern. I want missile defense to be fully funded. I want us to have the best possible defensive shield, but I would suggest that we may need to work on this amendment a little bit to make sure that it's on a classified-only basis and that we are fully aware of what transportable would mean. Also, as a technical matter, I don't know exactly how it works with the parliamentarian, but when we're looking at jurisdictional conflicts, concurrent or sequential, I was kind of wondering if the Department of Homeland Security would have say here, because most of our military weapons are housed on military bases. And if you're talking about sending them up and down the interstates of America, that would be more of a, because the gentleman knows that the interstate system was first developed as the National Defense Highway System. There were 4-lane roads so that tanks could be transported on those highways during the Cold War of the 1950s. So I don't know what scheme for transporting the gentleman is thinking about here, but if it's on the common roadways of America outside of military bases, I think that's something that would be a significant change from what most people have anticipated. So I'd be delighted to work with the gentleman. I share many of the gentleman's goals, but I want to make sure that we're not in any way aiding and abetting the enemy by having a public report on this matter, which could be of some sensitivity.
Would the gentleman yield?
Delighted.
Yeah, let me work with you on this between now and the full committee markup. I'd be happy to consider that
Okay.
very sensible request. And let me reassure you, I'm not scheming anything. This is just a report asking for an evaluation. And I think that the funding issue in particular is real important, given proposed cuts. And so I'd love to keep working with you on this. Appreciate your thoughtful comments.
Thank you.
And I yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my colleague from Colorado. I'm looking at this, and I think that with regard to this mobile, my understanding as I read this is that that's a defensive, not an offensive suggestion that you have. And that may raise some questions, but we recently had a hearing from the Missile Defense Agency, and as I recall that hearing, many questions were raised by the witnesses as to the viability and alternatives for missile defense. And I would draw the attention of the committee to that hearing as it applies to this particular amendment having to do with the funding issues that were discussed rather completely in that hearing. So without that, I just leave that on the table for our consideration as we move forward with this. In the meantime, I have some pretty serious questions about the funding levels for this particular system.
Is there further discussion? Seeing none, the question is on adoption of the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments? Mr. Franks is recognized to explain his amendment. Would clerk pass out the gentleman's amendment?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, essentially this amendment in its simplest explanation commences research, development, test, and evaluation activities with respect to a space test bed for a missile interceptor capability. This is not a capability that we have now, and our most robust opponents are making great strides in space, and it seems that the time has come for us to begin to plan for that eventuality. Mr. Chairman, our near-peer adversaries are now capable of attacking our critical space assets. This debate is no longer academic, and the question now before the subcommittee is what shall we do about it? These adversaries have taken note of the immense force multiplier U.S. space dominance provides our military, and they've also observed the defenseless nature of our space assets. And if we are to surrender the commanding heights of future battlefields without a fight, it will be the men and women in uniform who suffer the consequences as they find themselves cut off and fighting blind in austere environments far from home. China has clearly demonstrated an operational direct ascent anti-satellite missile capability and proven it can reach from geosynchronous altitudes to low Earth orbit. Russia has also tested a direct ascent ASAT, and North Korea and Iran have now both launched satellites into orbit. In fact, Mr. Chairman, Iran has just tested their Seymour space launch vehicle earlier this week. The threat is outpacing our technology. A recent Hudson Institute report, co-authored by over a dozen leaders in U.S. missile defense, arms control, and space policy, including 2 former directors of the NDAA and 2 former NORCOM commanders, said this, quote, "A space-based layer will dramatically augment U.S. terrestrially and sea-based defensive capabilities, reduce demands on current systems, and provide the United States with the optimal vantage point for destroying enemy missiles." Mr. Chairman, most significantly, a space-based layer provides, quote, "the ability to destroy many missiles during their boost phase while the missile is still over enemy territory and before the enemy can deploy their nuclear warheads, countermeasures, and decoys." Opponents of SBI argue that developing a space-based missile defense layer will provoke an arms race. But our near-peer enemies are currently investing in systems which exploit our gaps and vulnerabilities. We must close these gaps in our capabilities in order to deter future enemy investment. Opponents also argue that the technology is out of reach and remains cost prohibitive. But both a 2011 IDA study and a forthcoming report by the Hudson Institute, and I have it right here, Mr. Chairman, dispel this charge very robustly, in my opinion. There are no treaties prohibiting space-based interceptors, and concerns about debris are overstated since enemy missiles destroyed in the boost phase cannot produce long-lived orbital debris. Russia and China are signaling their strategy. They work to assault our space assets and exploit gaps in our missile defense network. Iran and North Korea, though less advanced, are much less predictable and continue to work feverishly to enhance their ballistic missile capabilities. If we wait for the threat to mature and materialize, the cost to rapidly develop an ability to counter it will grow exponentially. This amendment will lay the groundwork for future space-based layer of our missile defense. It will codify the will of the U.S. Congress to take the threat seriously and to begin the work of defending against it. Mutually assured destruction, Mr. Chairman, is only effective as a deterrent against a rational enemy. And rational enemies seem to be in short supply in this day and age. In the face of growing threats posed by unstable actors and increasingly belligerent great powers, it is our moral duty to oppose them on every front, and that now includes space. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Is there any further discussion on the gentleman's amendment? Chair, and I recognize the ranking member for any comments he has.
Mr. Chairman, I'd mentioned in my opening statement that almost all the amendments we were facing today were studies or reports, and those are of limited consequence. This amendment is ambiguous. It may be a study or a report, but when it says things like not later than 30 days after the date of enactment, the Director of NDAA shall commence the concept definition, design, research, development, and engineering evaluation and test of a space-based ballistic missile intercept. That seems to go possibly beyond a report. The language is continued on page 3 when it talks about space test bed. The Director shall commence research. So this seems to have greater implications than just fielding of study. But before I get into those specific implications, first I would urge the gentleman not to use rhetoric like surrender the commanding heights or fighting blind. I know of no one on this committee or in this Congress that wants to do either one. And as the gentleman well knows, so much of these issues are really best discussed on a classified basis, that I would suggest first to the gentleman that anything in this field be done on a classified basis so that we're not unwittingly disclosing to any of our potential adversaries or current adversaries what we might be thinking in this department. So that would be my first request to the gentleman, to not tip our hand in any way to folks, and the gentleman has correctly pointed that some of our adversaries are more irrational than even past adversaries have been. So we don't want to do anything to disadvantage our own country in pursuit of the gentleman's goals. Now, as far as the gentleman's goals are concerned, this is something that the Director of Missile Defense has spoken explicitly to. The quote from the April 14th hearing just a few days ago was, quote, "I have serious concerns about the technical feasibility of the interceptors in space, and I have serious concerns about the long-term affordability of a program like that." Now, that's just one commander and one hearing, but it seems to mirror the opinions of many commanders over many hearings. Again, I have concerns about a lot of this being discussed publicly at all, but some previous estimates from the National Academy of Sciences have not only questioned the technical feasibility, but also focused on cost. And as with the gentleman from Colorado, when I volunteered to work with him to make sure that all of our military is fully funded, some of the estimated costs on this Star Wars program are in the neighborhood of $100 to $300 billion. And at a time when we're not even fully funding our current military, I would suggest to the gentleman the greatest way to put fear in the eyes of our adversaries and potential adversaries is to first fully fund the military we have right now, and second to consider some of these other defensive and offensive alternatives that we may need to be considering. Because the gentleman is right, and throughout his career he's often focused on the technological cutting edge. Our military needs to be focused on things like that, but we don't need to be using unnecessary rhetoric when we do it. We don't need to be needlessly disclosing things in an open forum. We do not need to be needlessly disregarding the professional advice of some of our top missile advisors, and we do not need to be continuing to shortchange our military. The gentleman knows as well as I that sequestration is scheduled to last another several years, 4 or 5 years at least. The best thing we could do to help our military right now would be to end sequestration, and I hope that this Congress will have the will to do that. So there are many aspects of the gentleman's amendment that are interesting and may make sense. I would just urge the gentleman to withdraw the amendment at this time till we can really figure out whether it's a report or not, or whether it's really entering upon something that may be something the gentleman might regret. Because certainly he agrees with me that we do not want to disclose anything to our adversaries or potential adversaries. So with those hopefully constructive comments, I would urge the gentleman to withdraw the amendment, and if not, at least be open to modification of the amendment at the full committee level.
Is there further discussion on the gentleman's amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank the gentleman for what I consider to be some very constructive discussion. I would suggest at the beginning, in terms of loose rhetoric or loose language, that the gentleman's use of Star Wars is not a new concept. At the time Mr. Reagan began to pursue what he called the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars was the sort of the ad hominem response to that, suggesting that we would never be able to hit bullets with bullets, that the idea of any sort of missile defense was fantasy. And of course, history has dismissed that argument, but still today we use the term Star Wars, once again in my mind, to diminish the potential capability that this country has. Now first, let me address, Mr. Chairman, the testimony of some of the high echelon people over at MDA who I support and admire and revere in a tremendous way. I think sometimes it's important to keep in mind their circumstance when we bring up something that is rather new like this, that they have to be concerned that we might be requiring them to take funds from other priorities and things of that nature, so that they have to be, they're sort of hesitant to embrace something like this because they don't know what we're going to do. But this is not the intention of that effort, and I think if we relieved that argument, that we would see probably a more openness. But in any case, in terms of the gentleman suggesting that I suggest maybe the committee is willing to surrender, I don't suggest that at all. I know there's no one on this committee that wants to surrender the high ground of space, and yet at the same time, we've had this debate for a long time, Mr. Chairman, and that has been the ultimate effect of our arguments and discussions, is that we have indeed allowed our enemy to go forward and make great gains, especially in space. And it's now become almost an asymmetric situation where we're behind the times. And that's certainly not, I don't think, the will of the committee either. In terms of sequestration, Mr. Chairman, I voted against the sequestration and would embrace a change in that very bad policy. And beyond that, Mr. Chairman, I would just say in terms of my last point, in terms of irrational actors in the world, the gentleman is absolutely correct that we don't know what they will do. And I think that only underscores the purpose and need for the amendment. And so I cannot withdraw it at this time.
Thank the gentleman. Is there further discussion? Gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, is recognized.
I want to thank the gentleman for a really important discussion. The issue of classified and unclassified and signaling intentions, I think, is a real issue. There's some language in this particular amendment that I think needs to be modified. And it may be that should there be a classified annex in our NDAA, that this amendment and the previous one might very well fit into that classified. I'm going to withhold further comments and have a discussion with the chair and the ranking member about how we might proceed with and answer some of the questions that have been raised here, appropriately raised. I'll let it go at that.
I thank the gentleman. Is there further discussion on the gentleman's amendment? Gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Larson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just would note that Section 1685 of last year's NDAA directed the MDA to do an assessment and report that was due a year after the law passed, which puts a time frame sometime later this year on this very issue. And so an assessment and report back to us on this very issue. And this amendment seems to, by the wording, it seems, as I read it, seems to bypass any of that, would bypass any of that work and shortchange the work that we asked MDA to do to help us answer this question. So one, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves after having asked them. Second, I think we did hear from Admiral Searing about concerns about this particular type of proposal, and we also heard from him in an open setting some of the other options, alternative approaches that he thought would be a better, more fiscally feasible, and frankly more useful approach. The third thing I'd point out, Mr. Chairman, and I don't mean to surprise you with this question, but maybe you can answer it or help me answer it, on page 3, line 10, under subsection C on budget submissions, and whether just the format of this, whether the format of this amendment actually obligates us to. It sure reads that it obligates us to spending, and I'm wondering if this language is something that we do typically in amendments or in the bill, because it seems to bypass any sort of 302B allocations that we have or any authorizing that we have, and obligate spending in the future without sort of any identification of where it is. And I know that we're very particular in the committee, Mr. Chairman, if you could listen. I apologize, but it's an important question.
I was getting an answer to your question.
Oh, well, okay.
It's all about you, Mr.
I'm gonna change the question then. Whether or not it actually would then fit under the, like I said, I know we're very particular about in the budget, in the authorizing budget, that we stick to our sections, stick to our titles in terms of the budget allocations per title, and then when we do the full committee, we're sticklers about sticking to the top line for the full bill. So I'm curious about, I mean, I couldn't assess the cost of this and how it would fit into what we're currently allowed under the rules of the House, the rules of the committee, in order to fund this. So I'm wondering if there's an answer we can get to that before we move forward on this. Now he may whisper in your ear.
General Counsel just telling me that the amendment will be evaluated and scored before the full committee markup, but hasn't been so far, and this is in our authority.
Excuse me, if I may. What is this? You said this is in our...
This budget submission request. You were asking if it was outside the scope of the jurisdiction.
So the action is in our authority as a cost.
Right.
So what about the cost of it?
We don't know what the costs are, but it will be. After we leave this mark and go to the full committee, my understanding is we will get a... Yeah, General Counsel advises the chair that we will, at the end of the committee, ask that these items be scored and be brought to us before the full committee mark. So we will have the information at full committee mark, but we won't have it today.
Yeah, I don't know how we could have it today, but again, it would seem that if we approve this as is, then we got a mark, if I may, Mr. Chairman, then it would end up pushing aside other parts of the budget authorization, unless we increase the budget authorization, which I don't know if you all have permission to do.
Well, we don't know that yet. you know, we'll just have to deal with that. If we see that as being a problem, we'll have to revisit this at full committee, but we just don't know that right now. If it would have that effect.
It's fair enough. Fair enough. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is there any further discussion on the gentleman's amendment? If not, the question is on adoption of the gentleman from Arizona's amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Appearing the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments? Question now occurs on adoption of the mark. So many as in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Appearing the chair, the ayes have it. There's sufficient support. Let's see. Chair now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, for the purpose of a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the subcommittee report the mark as amended favorably to the full committee.
Question is now on the motion of the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn. So many in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Quorum being present, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Without objection, members have 5 legislative days within which to submit written statements into the record, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary conforming technical and clerical changes and to remove from the mark provisions that would cause the mark to refer to other committees or would result in additional direct spending or would result in an earmark.
Did you write that for me?
I did, just for you. But I would like to take that last sentence out about the earmarks, but that's another story. Without objection, so ordered. Let's see. There being no further legislative business, the subcommittee is adjourned.